Good evening. We have to start on time because one of our speakers has to leave at 6:15. So first of all, welcome to this panel on the food crisis. I'm Elisabeth Lindenmayer. I'm the acting director of the United Nations Study Program at SIPA. And how little did I know when we thought of this panel that we would do that in the context of a major financial crisis. The question is there still a food crisis? If there one, do we have a strategy? And if we have a strategy, do we have the means to implement this strategy? We will discuss all these questions tonight. I'll be very short in the introduction of our speakers because of the shortness of time. I just want to wish Jeffrey a Happy New Year. And I want to tell you that we really have wonderful speakers. We have here Jeffrey Sachs. I don't think he needs any introduction at SIPA. He's the director of the Earth Institute. He's worldly known. I don't think I have to speak too much about him, but I want to thank him for coming in spite of other obligations and to come and really share his views with you. All the CVs are outside, so I will be really short in the introduction. John Holmes is the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs at the United Nations, but in addition, he has been appointed by the Secretary General to be the coordinator of a task force on the food crisis, which is really, which includes all the agencies, programs, and funds of the United Nations. I do not envy him. I think it's the most difficult job at the UN to coordinate agencies, but I think he's doing an incredible job. This task force is chaired by the Secretary General himself. I do not know if the food crisis is still a priority of the United Nations, and that's why we put a question mark on our title, and I'm sure he will comment on this. Mr. Vashee is really coming from Zambia. He's the president of, I have to look because I am not familiar with the farmers organization that he represents. He is the president of the International Federation of Agricultural Producers, which is called IFAP, the World Farmers Organization representing over 600 million farm families, grouped in 120 national organizations in 79 countries. And he's also the president of the Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions, which is called SACO. So he represents the people, the farmers, and the problem of those on the ground. He's the only one, in a way, from representing the people tonight. Thoraya Obaid is the executive director of UNFPA. She was the first woman appointed as the director of that program and the first woman from Saudi Arabia. She is, if you are looking, the women in this room, if you are looking for a role model, a woman role model, you have it right here. I think Thoraya is the best manager and leader I have ever seen at the United Nations. So welcome her. She's a friend of SIPA. I will give the floor, I will break protocol tonight, and I intended to give the floor to John Holmes first because he's the coordinator of the task force on the food crisis, to which Jeffrey Sachs is a member, but because of the shortness of time and because we have only 15 minutes to listen to Jeffrey Sachs, we will give him the floor first. So if you have questions after that, maybe you can bombard him for a few minutes. You have the floor. You want to come here? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, for the panel and for your leadership on UN affairs at SIPA. And apologies to the panelists that I'm jumping the queue a little bit. There are too many crises today, also the financial crisis, and I have to go off and attend to a BBC story on the banking crisis live and in real time, so I apologize for having to leave early. Even before there was a hunger crisis this year, there was a hunger crisis. We had about 850 million people by the estimates of a year ago hungry. That number has gone up. We don't know by how many. One estimate is by 75 million to 100 million this year because of the unstable and soaring food prices, which have partly come back down, but which are still high in historical terms. But whether the prices have come up, come down, exactly where we stand, we have a hunger crisis on the planet, as we did a year ago, and 2 years ago, and 3 years ago, because there are vast numbers of hungry people. We actually have a nutrition crisis that is far bigger than the hunger crisis, because in addition to the billion or so who are hungry chronically, and the at least tens of millions, perhaps some low hundreds of millions who are acutely hungry because of the combination of chronic hunger plus acute distress from famine or dislocation, we also have another 1 to 2 billion people who suffer from chronic malnourishment because of micronutrient deficiencies and other nutrition-related problems of insufficiency. We also, in our weird time on our weird planet, have about 1 billion people who are suffering metabolic disorders, adult onset diabetes, obesity, and so forth from too many calories, but not healthy calories. And that's another epidemic sweeping the planet. In terms of our eating on this planet, we're in very bad shape. It may be 4 billion people who are facing some kind of serious trouble. Mass caloric and protein insufficiency, micronutrient deficiency, or obesity and metabolic disorders from a serious imbalance of lifestyle and nature of modern industrial food supply. I want to talk about the billion people who have been suffering from chronic hunger, and actually very briefly I want to talk about the few hundred million, maybe 300 to 400 million among them in Africa, and just say a few words quickly about that food challenge, because it is to a significant extent a readily solvable challenge which we simply have not yet been able to get organized to solve. About 75 to 80% of Africa's extreme poor, and that's a number that is perhaps in total extreme poor, maybe 400 million people. Maybe 75 to 80% of those, 300 to 350 million, live in rural areas in farm families. They're hungry farm families. All numbers have imprecision, by the way, in this, so one only works with ranges and general dimensions, because these are hard things to measure, and also we don't do a very good job of measuring anything related to poor people, because we don't do a good job about anything related to poor people, period, including measurement, but also helping them to stop being so poor. Africa's farm families are generally smallholder farmers, and Dr. Vashee represents them. His organization is the World Apex organization that represents national organizations that represent mainly smallholders. We at the Earth Institute are working in communities of about 500,000 people all over the continent of smallholder farmers. I can tell you something about those people in the Millennium Villages, but they represent people all through Africa. They're impoverished. They have almost nothing. They don't have safe water. They don't have electricity. They don't have roads. But one thing they also don't have are agricultural inputs. They don't have fertilizer and high-yield seed, except for the few farmers that are working on cocoa plantations, tea estates, coffee estates, and so forth. If you're a typical villager in Uganda, in Western Kenya, in Tanzania, in Malawi, in Mali, you're growing food for your own survival, and you're eating a staple crop, maybe maize, principally in East Africa. And the key is, and this is the only point I really want to make, the yield that you're getting for your efforts, which are back-breaking efforts, and it's a woman doing this back-breaking effort, you're getting about 1 ton per hectare of land, which is a productivity yield that is about 1/3 or 1/4 or 1/5 of your counterparts in other parts of the developing world. Now, most parts of Africa don't have a hectare of land per farm family. They have half a hectare, which is a shockingly small amount of land, a little bit more than an acre. And you have 5 people dependent on that. And with the yield of 1 ton per hectare, you're talking about half a ton if the rains don't fail on your half hectare farm. And in many places where we're working, it's 0.3 or 0.4 of a hectare. It's not enough to feed the family, much less to bring a surplus to the market. People in this situation, their villages, are trapped in extreme poverty. The basic, most important thing to understand is that that same farm could triple or quadruple its output with already existing technologies. Essentially, farmers don't have access to better seed, and they don't have access to fertilizer. So the soils are nutrient depleted. The seed is usually last year's seed, and the yield is a third or a fourth of what it should be. Farmers know this, but they can't afford the fertilizer and the seed on their own. They don't have cash balances, and at all of the places we're working, and it's basically true throughout most of tropical Africa, they can't get any credit, they have no collateral, and they don't have access to even microfinance for this kind of input. The result is every year there's hunger. The last 3 or 4 months before the harvest are terrible. Families can't feed themselves, and they don't get out of poverty. Now, Thoraya heads the UN Population Fund. This is another important dimension because the women in these villages typically don't have access to contraceptive services, family planning. There's often no clinic. That is, the Millennium Village is solving that in the narrow case, but more generally, women, the girls, are not able to go to secondary school. So early marriage, lots of children, total fertility rates of 5 or 6 or 7. And that means that the population is doubling every 25 years or so. And the farm sizes have shrunk, have shrunk, have shrunk, have shrunk. Final piece of the logic is every time you take out a crop, you take out nutrients with it. If you have lots of spare land, you rotate what's called slash and burn. But if you're down to your 0.3 to 0.5 hectares, which you have to farm every single year, year in, year out, you are working on dead soil, nutrient-depleted soil, nitrogen-deficient soil. So the benefits of fertilizer are extraordinarily important because these are not soils with reserves of nutrients, neither carbon in the soil, soil carbon, nor nitrogen, which is absolutely key and the limiting factor all over Africa. We send food aid as an emergency in these crises. If the rains fail a bit because of the weakness of the soil nutrients, then you lose the whole crop, because just like a child dies from a mild infection when the body is immunosuppressed, a crop fails completely from a short dry spell if it's already fragile because of soil nutrient depletion. Then comes the emergency food appeals and so forth, and as John knows, because he's the champion of this, how hard it is to get any attention in this world, even for starving people in the middle of emergencies, and the numbers are growing. The numbers of displaced people, the numbers of climate-shocked people, and so forth. The only solution is that people should be able to feed themselves. So in places with profound food production insufficiency, we need an agricultural approach, not only an emergency humanitarian approach. Long story short, 25 years ago, the World Bank said, leave it to the market. Just about the same time that Ronald Reagan said, leave it to the financial markets. And it's not a coincidence. It happened the same time. We've lived 25 years through this disastrous, laissez-faire, mixed-up ideology that has brought America also to its knees. It's the same thing. We called it in the World Bank structural adjustment. Here we called it, I don't know what we called it. We called it the Reagan Revolution, the free market revolution. Both have come crashing down because they're miserable economics. They're just wrong. Markets are fine, free markets are stupid ideas. And the World Bank took the donors out of Africa 25 years ago. Donors always like to be taken out of things because they don't really want to spend. So they were happy when the World Bank said, leave it to the markets. 25 years later, there have been 25 years of unsolved hunger, even though the technology is on the shelf to overcome this. Last year, the World Bank said, we're sorry. They did an internal analysis in their independent evaluation group, and they said 25 years we had the wrong strategy. We said, let the markets do it, but no markets came. Now, President Zellick is a big champion of getting proper help to the poorest of the poor so that they can start a positive cycle of development. Malawi did this 3 years ago. They've doubled their crop production each of the last 3 harvests by getting fertilizer and seed to their farmers. This year we've been trying to raise funds for smallholder farmers. My thought is we need a global fund for smallholder farmers, just like we have a global fund for AIDS, TB, malaria. The international system resists these kinds of innovations usually. There's turf. There are donors that don't want to be asked to spend more money. There are legitimate questions because you can't prove anything beforehand. You can only prove it in doing it. So far, it's not been a success. It's always worth pushing when you think you have the right idea. And I think a global fund for smallholder agriculture is urgent and is the right idea. So we keep pushing for financing. This year, and I'll stop here, there have been about $11 billion of nominal pledges given in speeches for agriculture. At least that was a sum that I heard quoted last week. But there has been, as far as I know, about 50 million Australian dollars actually put in the bank because Prime Minister Kevin Rudd actually deposited $50 million at the World Bank for this. The World Bank has put in a little bit more money, but essentially we have a hunger crisis that continues, that got worse this year, that could be solved. We need funding so that impoverished people can get out of the poverty trap by growing more food. And we need to help the UN Population Fund desperately because, as clever as the agronomists are, there is no solution with another doubling of Africa's population. That is the trajectory right now. We need a massive, rapid, voluntary reduction of fertility, but all the evidence is enable women to have access to contraceptive services, enable young girls to stay in school, especially through secondary school, and we will have that voluntary reduction of fertility rates dramatically. So this has to be an effort that takes into account all time scales. We need emergency food aid when people are starving. We need to help farmers grow more food. We need to invest in basic infrastructure, and we need to invest in sexual and reproductive health services and a voluntary fertility reduction so that we can reach sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. John, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, and thank you for organising this event. And I welcome the interest being shown in this fundamental subject. It's a bit difficult to follow Jeffrey because he's just given you all the answers. But I will try to go back a stage, if you don't mind, and look at some of the questions and give a bit of an overview of what we call, perhaps wrongly, the global food crisis. And I apologise in advance, it'll be a rather hasty and probably rather superficial overview in some senses, but it seems to me it's probably best to begin at the beginning, at least to begin at the beginning of this year's beginning, which is when the world noticed this spring that suddenly food prices were beginning to rocket up everywhere and that there was something of a crisis. Some of the basic commodities of the world, wheat and rice and maize, were rising, at least on global markets, by 100% or more, higher than they had been a year earlier. And if this was noticeable even in developed countries like the US, to some extent in the shops, the effect in developing countries was obviously much greater. These kind of global prices had an immediate impact in virtually all developing countries, and a very drastic impact. The rises were sometimes not as much as the 100% being seen on the global commodity markets, but certainly prices in many places for staple elements of the diet were rising by something like 50% or more. And so the world took even more notice of this when political stability started to suffer, because prices are one thing, political stability and governments' ability to run their countries is quite another. So when countries actually began to be threatened by food riots, as many were at an earlier stage in this year, one government, actually the government in Haiti, was actually overthrown because of food prices, then again, people began to take serious notice. All of a sudden, people began to feel threatened in a way they hadn't before, and we had what became known as the global food crisis. And of course, as Jeffrey Sachs said very clearly and eloquently, this crisis didn't start this spring at all. Hundreds of millions of people have been going to bed hungry for many years, more than 800 million in the years running up to this year, and probably another 100 million this year, as Jeffrey said. And aid institutions like the World Food Programme, which is there to deal with the worst effects of global hunger, are only able to feed at best something like 100 million, so not much more than 1/10 of those because of the resources they have and their ability to deal with this. And they're only dealing with the most vulnerable groups, say 100 million or less amongst this 800 or 900 million. So there's nothing new about the problems, and again, Jeffrey made this clear, the problems of access to and the affordability of food for much of the world's poor, even if it's accompanied, again, as he made clear, by obesity and waste in much of the developed world. Nevertheless, I think what happened this spring, these rocketing prices and this awareness of it, was a turning point, because it did mark the end of an era, a long era, of cheap, plentiful, affordable food, at least on a global scale, when food could be bought by countries, could be bought even if it wasn't appropriate or the natural diet of people. Rice became the natural diet of many people when it wasn't grown in many countries, for example, in Africa. So but that era of cheap, plentiful food was coming to an end. And I think the origins of the current crisis do run deep, and we just need to look at them very briefly, because they are basic underlying factors. I think the first driver of all this is population growth, and Jeffrey made the point very clearly. I think it is absolutely fundamental. No one talks about it anymore, apart from Thoraya, for various reasons, including perhaps policy in this country, but it is absolutely fundamental. The population is continuing to grow. We need to grow. We need to have 50% more food just to feed the world the same way as we feed it now, which is not very well. By 2030, we need to double food production by 2050 to keep pace with the 9 billion people and more there will be. Secondly, there are changing food habits in some parts of the world. This is a good thing. If India and China, for example, with their huge populations, are becoming more prosperous and that people are able to eat better, this is entirely desirable. It's not a criticism, as is sometimes alleged. Nevertheless, it is true that people are eating better, and when they eat more meat, that requires more grain, it requires more land to grow it. That has an effect on the supply of food in the world. And what we're talking about here is a fundamental shift, I think, in the nature or the relationship between supply and demand. Thirdly, we have the lack of investment in agriculture, particularly developing country agriculture that we're talking about, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We have the effects of urbanization all over the world, which is reducing the quantity of agricultural land available. We have land degradation coming from very poor farming practices, lack of fertilizers, as again Jeffrey was explaining in many places. We have erosion coming from deforestation. We have desertification and all the effects of climate change, which are undesirable in the main for agriculture, whether they be floods in some places and droughts in others. And finally, and perhaps most controversial in some ways, but also hardest to evaluate, you have the effect of biofuels, the land being used to grow crops which are then turned into energy, for very good reasons to do with climate change, obviously, and the need to reduce emissions, but the effect on food had not been anticipated in the way that it should have been. So I think it was all these factors, and there are others as well, plus no doubt a bit of speculation on the commodity markets, which really culminated this spring in this explosion of prices which we saw. And the effects were, as always, hardest on the poorest and most vulnerable people, another 100 million hungry, but also much more subtle and invisible effects, and again, as Jeffrey was mentioning, on nutrition. People's nutrition status starts to decline. It doesn't happen overnight. People don't starve overnight. They simply start to eat less well. If they ate 3 meals before, many didn't, they eat 2 now. If they ate 2 before, they eat 1 now. If they ate 1 before, they struggle to eat anything. And they're eating worse food, less nutritious food, cheaper products, things which have simply gotten less nutritional value, which has a devastating effect, particularly on small children. But the effects are wider than that as well. People start to sell their assets in order to simply to survive, because if 100% of your income already goes on food, or 90%, the price of food doubles, obviously you have to sell things just to keep things going at all. So people sell their assets, they sell their livestock, which is actually their livelihood at the same time, and also they begin to spend even less than they were spending before, if they had any money at all, on health and education. So children stop going to school, families stop going to the local clinic if there is one. So the knock-on effects of this food crisis, of the food price rises, are very insidious but very long-term. There was also a double whammy, because the effect of helping people, the cost of helping people for organisations like the World Food Programme was also rising very fast, because the food you have to give to people was also more expensive. The transport was more expensive, because, of course, we're also talking about a fuel price crisis at the same time. So one example, the World Food Programme calculated, World Food Programme budget at the beginning of this year was approximately $3 billion. They now believe they need $6 billion simply to get through this year, mainly to cope with existing needs, but perhaps some extra needs as well. $6 billion, well, it's a lot of money or little money. It's not a lot of money compared with $700 billion for a financial rescue, but it's a lot of money if you have to raise it from donors in an individual way. And then you had this crisis compounded by, because of the fuel price crisis I was also talking about, the effects compounded by massive rises in the price of fertilizers, which have doubled or worse. They've risen more than food itself, and the effect on prices of high-quality seeds as well. So while developed country farmers could be relied on, if you like, to respond to the price signals in the market, they would start to plant more and harvest more, and that should have an effect. The opposite was actually the case for most small farmers in developing countries, and the effect is that they are planting less. They are affected by the price rises of the food they have to buy, because most have to buy food as well. But the inputs they need to actually produce food at all, that is the seeds, transport if they happen to have any mechanized tools, which of course most don't, and above all fertilizers, these are all much more expensive. So the effect is they are planting less, and they will be harvesting less this year than ever before. And these smallholder developing country farmers we are talking about are perhaps 450 million in the world. That's 2 billion people, if you take into account the size of their families as well. So it's all this which explains the current apparent paradox we have, which is that some global food prices are now falling again, particularly wheat. Wheat has fallen a long way from the price it was this spring, and in fact to slightly lower than it was paradoxically last year, because harvests in developed countries, the US, Europe, Australia, and some big developing countries are going to rise, but prices in developing countries are still rising, and still rising rapidly. The crisis is still getting worse for most people in most countries. So the first point I want to make is that whatever the global price trend may be, this is still emergency, this is still a crisis, even if it's drowned out by the financial crisis at the moment, and even if, frankly, the media have moved on. They were full of it 3 months ago. You'll struggle to find much mention of it today, but that doesn't mean the crisis has gone away. And in answer to the question, the implicit question in the title of the session today, yes, it does remain a top priority for us and for the UN system. Now, we've talked about, I've talked about the threats posed by this crisis quite a lot already. I think we also need to regard it as an opportunity. And it is an opportunity because it's an opportunity to reverse the decades of bad policy and bad practice and, frankly, bad thinking that we've seen in the past 20 or 30 years. And that bad policy has not been confined to the World Bank and the IMF, although they suffered from it too. I think all institutions engaged in agriculture, with 1 or 2 exceptions, and all national governments, with 1 or 2 exceptions, have had the same thought. Food was cheap and plentiful. We don't need to invest so much of our public spending. or our investment capital in agriculture. Let's invest it in more productive things, more modern things. That was the trend. They said, let's not blame it all on the World Bank, although they had their share in this. And so the net effect was this reduction in investment in agriculture in developing countries, and we can see the consequences of that now. So what we don't need to do is to start to work on reversing that. This is an opportunity because of the awareness we all have, because of the price rises. This is an opportunity to get this message through and to get this message to stick, as long as we can prevent attention from moving on too far, too quickly. Because we do need, as I said, and I'll repeat it, we need to double food production by 2050 just to keep pace with the rising population and changing habits. And we have to do that essentially with the same land area. I mean, there's a little bit more land you can put into production, maybe, certainly in Africa there is, but it's not very much. It's probably 10% at most. We have to do that with a less reliable climate. As I said, we have to do it with water resources which are, if anything, declining, not increasing, certainly in reliability. And we have to do this in ways which are actually sustainable, because the answer is not all fertilizers. Fertilizers are also environmentally very tricky, not least in an era of rising emissions. So we have to try and find ways of doing this which are more sustainable by some kind of new methods of conservation agriculture, which remain to be devised, at least on a commercial scale. But if we can do all this, we can put more food in the mouths of these 2 billion people who are the families of the developing country farmers. We can also make a huge contribution to poverty reduction at the same time. So what is the UN system actually trying to do about this? I think it's reasonable to say that we recognised the gravity of the crisis reasonably early, and the Secretary-General decided that we had to take a lead on this. So we decided that what we needed to do was to put all the institutions of the UN system, the different agencies, the World Food Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organisation, the Institute for Agricultural Development, UNICEF, which deals with child nutrition, many other organisations, all together, all working in the same way, all trying to get unified policies and approaches. You may think that's obvious, but if you worked in the UN system, you would realise it's not as obvious as all that to make that happen. But also, the idea was to make sure that all these UN institutions working together were also working together with the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and all the other key international organizations which have an influence on this. And then to try and make sure that this group working together could work together successfully with national governments, who are actually in the lead, of course, in the agricultural policies in their own countries, with the private sector. And let's not forget that agriculture is essentially a private sector activity. Most farmers are obviously private individuals. Most of the investment will have to come from the private sector in one form or another, and the civil society and the NGOs, who are also crucial actors in this. So that's why we set up this high-level task force, which the Secretary-General chaired, with the participation of all these UN institutions and the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO, to make sure that we were aligning our policies and our approaches, and we could do this on a collective basis. And we produced a document which is called the Comprehensive Framework for Action. There are some copies, I think, outside the door. And the idea was to produce some recommendations for practical action by governments, but also by NGOs and others. Not a single recipe for every country, because every country is different, but at least a menu of actions that governments could take and other people could align themselves with, which would provide, we thought, the right kind of approaches to this kind of crisis. And what we did was identify two separate sets of actions, if you like, all aimed at developing country small farmers. We were not concerned with what should happen about developed country agriculture, except insofar as concerns subsidies perhaps, but this is all aimed at increasing agricultural production and food security in developing countries. So the two sets of actions were, firstly, the first set was aimed at things that we needed to do right now to tackle the absolute emergency, and that's things like, obviously, continuation and stepping up emergency food aid and nutritional interventions for those who need it. Food aid is not the answer to problems. It's not really a good investment, but if people are starving, you have to provide it while you try to increase their resilience on a longer term. Secondly, and this goes very much to the points that Jeffrey Sachs was making, we need to provide the kind of inputs that these farmers need right now for this year, or at least the next planting season, in the shape of fertilizers and high-quality seeds. Because if they don't have those things, there's nowhere their production is going to go up, and they need these things not in 5 years or 10 years. They need them right now. And then thirdly, on these very short-term sets of actions, we wanted to encourage governments to take the right kind of policy decisions about, for example, not actually imposing export restrictions on their own food production, which may seem to make sense from any individual country's point of view, any individual government's point of view, but collectively simply made the price crisis worse, simply made the availability of food worse. Also, we wanted to encourage governments to, if they needed to subsidise food in one way or another, and this is a perfectly reasonable response in some way, do it in the right way, do it in the right targeted way. Don't put in place generalised food subsidies which benefit everybody, target the most vulnerable groups, set up the right kind of social safety nets if you can, if the government has the capacity to do it. So get your taxation and subsidy policies right, and there are right ways and wrong ways of doing this. Governments take their own decisions, but these are recommendations we were making. So those are the kind of things we were saying they should be doing in the very short term. The second set of actions were also things which we need to happen now, but they are aimed at producing longer-term effects. So we're not trying to divide things into things to do now and things to do later. All this needs to be done now, but some of them have short-term effects and some of them have longer-term effects. So this second group of actions was about producing more lasting investment in smallholder production in developing countries. And in particular, and we mustn't underestimate this at all, it's not just about the fertilizers and the seeds, or crucial though they are, it's about changing the whole rural infrastructure. Because if you don't have the transport, the roads, you can't bring the inputs in, you can't get your products out to market. If you don't have the marketing structures, the cooperatives or whatever it might be, there's no marketing. If you don't have storage facilities, probably on a cooperative basis again, you can't keep the crops. Crop wastage in many developing countries is up to 40%. This is something which can be corrected relatively easily with relatively small investments, but we have to do it. You need to make sure you have the right kind of small microcredit available for farmers to buy the inputs they need. You need to make sure that the land issue is tackled. In many countries, small farmers, particularly in many countries, particularly women farmers, do not have title of the land they are farming, so obviously the incentives to invest are not there. The incentives to produce more, apart from what you need for yourself, are not there. So again, these are all extremely important things to tackle as part of a longer-term program to improve the rural infrastructure, which then provides the context in which small farmers can actually operate properly. Then you need to, again, improve the kind of social safety nets, social safety systems which exist to make sure they are targeting the right people and they can operate in the right way and produce the right incentives. We need to get the trade structure right for agriculture. I think we're all conscious that there's a lot of protectionism in developed countries against developing country agriculture. I mean, you can criticize the World Trade Organization talks and the Doha round, but some of those things would have made a bit of difference in actually improving trade in agricultural products. Because one of the things we're trying to say to countries is do not go for self-sufficiency. Grow more food for yourselves. Do not try to grow everything you need, because that's not a sensible division of labour. There needs to be a scope for trade in agricultural products. But the condition for that is that the markets have to be open in both directions, not only in one direction, which tends to be the case at the moment. And of course, going with that is all the question of removing all the trade-distorting subsidies which developed countries have imposed. There are other ideas which need to be developed in the long term. Do we need grain reserves on a regional level, a national level, even a global level, to make sure we can cope when we have huge price spikes, as we did earlier this year. And then finally is the need to work out a better consensus, if you like, on what do we do about biofuels. There's no simple answer to this. Countries have very different views, very divided views on this. We need to try and find a way of arriving at a consensus on where is it legitimate and good, if you like, to use land for biofuels and to use crops for biofuels, because there are some crops which are not food crops which you can legitimately use for biofuels, and where does it not make sense, because you're actually taking food out of the system and out of the mouths of particularly the poor. Now this comprehensive framework for action I've been talking about, that's a document, obviously. That doesn't solve any problems by itself. We're extremely conscious of that. It's a bureaucratic response to the problem. So we need to do some things. We need to do some things very quickly, and Jeffrey Sachs, again, was talking about them. But I think essentially 3 major things need to happen if we're going to make any progress, and they need to happen with all the actors I've talked about: governments, UN agencies, the World Bank, civil society, NGOs, the private sector, all working together in the same direction. So we need to get the policies, national policies and international policies right, so they provide the right incentives for farmers to produce. The right trade and tax and land issues are being tackled at national level. Things are being done to encourage women farmers, who are such a huge part of the workforce, and incentives are there. The right kind of encouraging environment is there. Secondly, we need to make sure that the techniques which are available are made available to small farmers in Africa and elsewhere, and that the technology, if it's not there, needs to be developed. So we need more research in agricultural technology and all that goes with that. And I think there's some room for putting a lot more money into that, but actually taking the results of that research and turning it into practice, implementing it on the ground. That's what actually needs to be done. And thirdly, and crucially, it needs lots more resources. We have estimated, but it's a very rough estimate, and Jeffrey Sachs told you most of the figures in these things are very rough, and they certainly are, and the more you look at them, the rougher they look in some respects. But we nevertheless estimated that we need an extra $25 to $40 billion a year from all sources, from governments, from international institutions, from the private sector, going into this developing country agriculture to make the kind of difference we need to make over a period of 5 to 10 years, so that we can increase production as we want to do that. And what we need to do in doing that is reverse some of the trends that we've seen in the last 30 years. I talked about these 30 years of neglect of investment in agriculture. 30 years ago, African governments invested 10% of their public spending in agriculture or agriculture-related investment. Now that figure is more like 3%. 30 years ago, the major donors invested something like 10%, or had about 10% of their overseas aid was related to agriculture or rural infrastructure. That percentage, again, is down to more like 3 or 4%. If you could reverse those percentages over the next few years, then that might begin to provide some of the resources you need. I say both from donors and national governments and the private sector. I think the public sector has to kickstart this with the investment we need, but the private sector will have to pick up from that. When I say the private sector, I mean the private sector in every possible way, as I say, including individuals. So if we can then create a virtuous circle where you are producing more inputs, you are producing higher productivity for these small farmers, then I think we can start to make a real difference, as I say, both to food production and to poverty. What we need is a new green revolution in Africa. The green revolution has never happened in Africa as it did in Asia, but there's no reason why it shouldn't. There's nothing wrong with the soil. If you have the right irrigation, the right inputs, it can happen, and that's what needs to happen. Africa is the solution. Africa is not the problem, but we need to make a huge effort to make that happen. Finally, how are we doing with all this? The answer is not very well. 6 months on, the context is not promising because of the financial and economic crisis for governments to provide lots more resources in this direction, I fear. The resources, as you heard from Jeffrey Sachs, are not flowing. Policies are not changing as much as we would hope. And the attention we're getting from governments, from the media, is diminishing. So the focus is diminishing, and you could feel that happening during the General Assembly high-level debate which we had last week. So there's an awful lot to do. I think we know what needs to be done. It can be done. The techniques are there, the knowledge is there, the policies are there. We just have to make it happen, and that requires a lot of will and a lot of resources. And if we lose the focus on this crisis, then the danger is that we'll miss this opportunity, which is definitely there. I hope today's discussion will help to focus attention on it, at least in this context. And I hope that the anger which is referred to in your title, and which is absolutely necessary if we're going to do something about this, even before this global food crisis, if that anger is there, that can be channeled into real action as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a lot to think about. I'll give the floor to Thoraya immediately.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, for inviting me. I have become one of the fixtures of the SIPA panel discussions. But after John's and Jeffrey's presentation, I will bring you down to a much more sadder context, but a real context as well. Both Jeffrey and John said that women producers, women vulnerable groups, etc. But the story is much more serious than just simply a sentence that we insert here or there. And I'll begin by a story of a woman from Nicaragua who works, basically, her income comes from making tortillas and selling it. So you can figure it out now. She certainly cannot afford the price of the corn, of the tortillas. She had to make decisions what to do because everything has doubled. If she keeps her daughter in school to help, keep her out of school to help with tortillas, they might be able to raise enough money to buy cooking oil, maybe a little bit of milk, and so on. So here you have a transgenerational, intergenerational poverty, basically, and hunger, and so on, going from one generation to another. We know that in the developing countries, families spend 70% of their income on food, compared to the developed countries who spend between 15 to 18% of their income on food. So when the 75% of income and the prices go higher, it means whatever income there is has to feed the family. And what happens in these cases is that women are the ones who remain without food. It's a choice we make as mothers because plus culture, it requires that men have to be fed well. You can't let your children remain hungry, so eventually we do not get the food and the nutrition that we have. And that's why women become much more vulnerable, especially if they're pregnant, if they're nursing, as well as infants that goes with that. Also, the sad part is that women are out. We know that there are figures that 7 out of 10 of the world hungry are women and girls. So you already have the whole poverty issue there. And if they do not get the nutrition when they're pregnant, then the babies are born malnutritioned, and it becomes what we call a permanent malnutrition that is taken from one generation to another. So you have a new weaker generation coming up, then. The other sad part, of course, is that women are agricultural workers, and as John said, they are mostly the workers in the farms. And therefore, as they are working so hard to get the food on the tables, they are responsible for it, they do not get the wealth or part of it. Not only that, from a cultural point of view, the setup, women, if we talk about Africa, that's most hit, women not only grow the food, they fetch the water, they shop and sell in the market, they cook the meals, and they're supposed to have everything ready for the family. The World Food Program has said an estimate that there are about that both the food and fuel crisis have pushed around 130 million people across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But if you look, and that's what the World Food Program says, because they provide food for immediate humanitarian aid, they say if you look even physically, you will see that the women are the hungriest and they are the skinniest, the thinnest. And that the aid workers say that malnutrition among women is emerging as a hidden consequence of the food crisis. There is a recent study by the Catholic Relief Services. They found, for example, in Burkina Faso, that's when we said that 75% of the income goes on food, but now decisions are being made. If the child is sick, medication goes out, school fees go out, and schools go out. There is also, I don't know if any of you have seen the Washington Post recently, but there was a story by Kevin Sullivan about a woman called Fanta Lingani. And Fanta Lingani, she's from Burkina Faso, and she goes out of her house at 4 o'clock in the morning, quietly, because she has to sweep the streets. And as you know, Burkina Faso ranked 176 in the ranking of the 177 in the UN Human Development Index. And she will work, then come back and finish the housework, etc. And in 2 weeks, she will get $10 for the work that she has done that well. But that's the added problem. She says that women are born with this job. The man has to have his share, and we have to make sure the kids have their share so we eat less. That's a real woman speaking to a journalist. Her husband goes on to say that men don't help with shopping and cooking because that's the job of women. And like many men interviewed in this article, he said that the African culture clearly defines roles of men who work outside the house and women who manage children and meals. Last year, and I quote, he said, "We could eat well, but now forget it. My sons don't work, so it's up to me to feed 25 people in the family." That's what Jeffrey Sachs was talking about. That's why the women sweep. We don't have anything, so they have to work. That's life. So even it's kind of a futility environment. It's the psychological impact of poverty, with hunger, with malnutrition. It becomes a state of depression, which makes it even more difficult to pluck people out of where they are and to push them forward to find solutions. But at the same time, we don't have to say that there is no solution or that women are always the victims. I think I want to end by saying that women are part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. And here, again, there has been a certain knowing that women are agricultural workers, then investing in women is a very good, smart economics, as the World Bank says. Not only if we delay marriage of young girls, then fertility is delayed. If they go to school, then they make decisions about their own fertility, and that gets the voluntary lower population that Jeffrey Sachs was talking about. But also, if women have access to a comprehensive package of not only family planning, but reproductive health that takes care of adolescents, then women in their reproductive age, then women after the reproductive age, you've got a healthier cohort of women who do not have to give their whose children don't have to inherit neither the malnutrition, nor the poverty, nor the absence of knowledge, etc. And in finding or placing women as part of the solution in the food crisis, I'll highlight a few things. Among them, that women are often known to be the carriers of traditional knowledge about agriculture before all this modernization take place. They know what needs to be done. And therefore, cultivating the knowledge of women in terms of tradition until we can do what John is telling us to do, invest more in agriculture, and there has to be some, picking the knowledge of women who know about agriculture and how we go. Also, women have the capacity to own both to earn and to control the income, because they're the ones who determine how the household will have a food security. Also, they are the driving force behind agriculture, and that's what John was saying. And therefore, investing in them as farmers, and I am hoping my friend Vashee will speak about whether they are in the agricultural groups, trade groups or whatever. Do they have a role? Are they given credit? Do they own land? Can they access equipment? Can they access technology? They are the farmers. And so where are women placed in terms of the benefits that are often going to the men agricultural workers or farmers and not to the women farmers? So I think as we talk, we need to look at the bigger picture of the food crisis, looking at the social impact, the focus on women as being the sources of food security in many ways, and whether we can have the correct investment in them to allow what John is saying to come out of this crisis in a better way with everybody involved, and decreasing the possibilities of intergenerational poverty and intergenerational ill health. I will stop here and we'll have more discussion.
Thank you very much. We now give the floor to our farmers. Dr. Vashee, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. When you're the last speaker, lots been said that has to be said, and I'll try not to be repetitive. But just to start off with, I think this current food crisis has come as no surprise to the farmers of the world. This has been a slow build-up of a number of issues, and foremost amongst this has been the neglect of the agriculture sector for over 20 years. And also as a result of the diminishing surpluses of food from OECD countries as they undertake reforms themselves. And this also had a negative effect in many developing countries where important policy reforms in the agriculture sector were actually stopped or halted as a consequence of a lot of cheap food that was floating around. And it also prevented important investment in the agriculture sector. There were 3 or 4 neuro issues which came to a head, which brought this crisis to where it is. One of them was the issue of climate change. We've had global crop failures, such as the one we had last year when we had a massive drought in Australia, and they had a big failure with their wheat crop. And as a consequence, you saw a big jump in the price of wheat. We're having more and more animal diseases globally as a consequence of climate change. And also the quest of many countries for energy independence and cleaner and environmentally friendlier fuels. And the third issue has been these emerging markets in India, China, and even in the Middle East, where people now have more disposable income and affordability to buy more food. What is it that we require to address this? And fundamentally what's been said, it's more investment, but investment in basic infrastructure, in roads, communications, also more investment in irrigation, because a lot of the farming in developing countries is rain-fed, and with climate change we require more and more public investment in irrigation and irrigation schemes to mitigate this. We also need more investment to transform small-scale agriculture into mainstream agriculture markets. We need concerted programs to enable people to do this, because it's not going to happen on its own. And also, most importantly, will be the ability to build commodity supply chain. A lot of smallholder farmers require a lot of help to meet standards, to participate in these markets, and meet traceability requirements, for instance. Again, this will require massive public investment, concerted programs that will target smallholder farmers into these kind of supply chains. The other important issue that needs to be done is the managing of the risk. A lot of farmers are prepared to make a go of things, step up production, but unless there is assurance that they will have confidence and a fallback position against the weather, against disease, and risks in the market, and most important, financial risks, if there is a crop failure with loan repayments. A lot of farmers have their backs against the wall because simply the weather hasn't played up with them, and as a consequence they owe colossal amounts of money, both in developed and developing countries, to the financial institutions. These are some of the measures that will really need to take place if we expect food production to be stepped up. The other one on climate change, again, there's an issue of mitigation, which a lot of farmers in developed countries are doing through production of bioenergy and renewables. And a lot more needs to be done on adoption. Again, it will require more research and extension. But most importantly, it comes with a cost. And it's important to recognize that if we want the producers of food to also take care of the environment and other renewable resources, they will need to be paid. And somehow this needs to be factored in. And the last issue I had on a global context was trade. It's already been talked about. But under the WTO discipline, I think we need to factor in the food crisis. Most of the negotiation on this round has not focused on this, and I think farmers will require space to work with national governments to meet national food security requirements. They will require space to get organized in the market, space to manage the risk that goes with the production of food in this environment. And I agree wholly that it's important that countries do not take knee-jerk reactions such as export bans. The World Food Programme had a problem finding the money. When they eventually did find the money, they had another major problem. They couldn't find the food because wherever there were surpluses, countries had put in export bans. So it's important that we allow the world multilateral global trading system to go on as it's going. But one thing that I thought I should bring to your attention in the presence of people like the UN system here is that we have a unique situation. And when we have a unique situation, it will demand a unique solution. And I would have thought and expected that the UN task force would have representation of the International Farmers Group in their midst. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened. It's business as usual. It's only the multilateral agencies and government that are part of the task force. And what are we faced with? A bureaucratic solution to the food crisis. I think people may have even accepted that in passing. So I think it's important that unless we make our solutions farmer-centered, the people who are going to do this for you, the people who are on the ground, who have the expertise, who have been through this, who know the solutions, we're not going to move very far. We will have short-term fixes, but we're not going to have the long-term sustainable fixes we're looking for. Coming to Africa, we had a declaration called the Maputo Declaration under the African Union, which said that all African governments were going to step up 10% of their budgets, national budgets, towards agriculture. 4 years down the line, only 7 African countries have managed to meet this requirement. Only 7, despite this crisis which we have. Although world hunger has been projected to drop from 885 million in 1990 to 772 million in 2020, for Africa, and only for Africa, it's been projected to rise from 138 million to 273 million in 2020. So the situation is still there. But for Africa, I think we need some more solutions, which perhaps as an African I'm proud to announce or to accept. We need peace and stability. We don't need conflicts. We need stable policy environments. We need investment in infrastructure. We need to do more about storage and harvesting. I mean, there's a study that's been done that if we're able to reduce post-harvest losses in Africa, we will increase supply of food by as much as 30%. It doesn't require a lot to fix. We also require more investment in rural electrification. And when it comes to access of resources, we require secure land tenure, which is a major problem for smallholder agriculture. Secure water rights. A lot of the water rights are being held by multilateral nationals, by mining conglomerates, by city councils for public water usage, and the little farmer down the road has no access to water. These are simple sort of solutions, but these are the practicalities which people face. Coming to farm inputs, I don't think the price of oil is going to go much below the $100. And as a consequence, fertilizer, which is a major input, is going to remain high. As I'm talking to you, the price of fertilizer in Africa has gone up 200%. At the moment, before I left and I came here, we were looking at $1,200 a ton, which is well beyond the means of a lot of farmers. And again, the solution is let's find money, let's make fertilizer affordable. But again, the lessons of the past have to be taken into consideration. There were a lot of subsidies in Africa, a lot of subsidies in the developed world. And what has that resulted in? It has to be targeted, and you have to have a withdrawal strategy fixed with any subsidy you're putting in place. Or else the dependency will come in, it will become a political solution, and we will not move away from this. The sustainability which we are looking in the global agricultural scenario won't happen. Again, there is a big question of market displacement. Whenever we've had subsidies, you will find that the market crowds out the private sector. It crowds out those farmers that are participating, including small-scale farmers who are able to work the market, borrow from the financial system, and sell into the market. They are being displaced. We need to work a solution where we need fertilizer and cheap inputs. At the same time, we need to ensure that those farmers that are participating in the economy are not displaced. Knowledge transfer, we've talked about. Empowerment of farmers in the markets. This is important if we're able to bring the farmers and integrate them into the value chain. It's good for the consumers as well because it will eliminate a lot of the middlemen. And it will reduce transaction costs, which will mean that food will still remain fairly affordable to a lot of people. The last thing for Africa is capacity building for farmers' organizations. We need independent civil society organizations that are able to participate in policy formulation processes, who are able to assist farmers get organized in the markets, who are able to prioritize the allocation of resources. It's one thing to say we need resources. It's another thing to find the money. How do you prioritize it? How do you ensure that it works? Because in the past, there's been a lot of money that's been given to developing countries. Why hasn't it worked? So as I said, there's no short-term fixes. You won't need a bureaucratic solution because it won't fix it. Governments have to resist the temptation for cheap food and input subsidies. And any plan without the principal stakeholder, the farmer, will not be part of the solution. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, John, is the United Nations taking a bureaucratic approach to the food crisis? And are you prepared to recommend to the Secretary General that the Farmer Association is part of your task force? I give you the floor.
Okay. Well, I mean, I hope we're not being too bureaucratic. I mean, we have produced a piece of paper, so that's bureaucracy by definition. But it is supposed to be, and I hope it is, focused on actual practical things we need to do and not just theory. And I hope if you read it that you will agree with that. On the question of the composition of the task force, I mean, this task force was simply composed of the main UN institutions dealing with aspects of food and the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. There's all sorts of other people not on it. Right. There are no governments on it, which is a good or a bad thing, depending on your point of view. The regional development banks aren't on it, for example, which are hugely important players. The big NGOs are not on it. They're also upset. The private sector isn't on it. And farmers' organisations aren't on it either. But we wanted to have a manageable group to produce some recommendations. Now, what we're actually trying to do, because this task force is not only about producing this document, is then to produce ways in which we can interact with all these groups. And we did interact with a lot of them in producing these recommendations. How we can interact with them in a more sustained manner, so we're actually incorporating their views. And I agree absolutely that farmers' organisations and farmers themselves, they know. They are doing it on the ground. We need to make sure we're capturing their views. The main way we're trying to do that is not at a global level, but actually at a national level. So at a national level, we're saying to everybody we can, get everybody together in a group with the farmers' organisations, the NGOs, the private sector, the government, the UN institutions that are present there, get round the table, produce a national plan to increase food production, to do whatever you need to deal with food insecurity, to make sure you've got everybody on board and do it at that national level. Say, if we do it at global level, it's going to be too vague, frankly. At national level, I think we can do it. So there is then an integrated approach, a comprehensive approach, which everybody can sign up to. But even then, you've got to make it happen, but at least you've got everybody, all the main actors around the table. So we're trying to deal with it while recognising that, I mean, agriculture, and as I say, you have to look at the rural infrastructure as a whole, is a very complicated area with lots and lots of stakeholders and no magic solutions. And we're trying to take account of views as much as we can.
Okay, I think I'm going to open the floor to questions so that we have a dialogue with students. I suggest that you go to the microphone, you make a line, you introduce yourself, and you tell us if you want a particular speaker to answer your question. Go ahead.
My name is Jerry Hush. I'm a sociologist who, this is very uncomfortable. Just a minute. If anyone's 6 feet tall, they'll use it. I'm sure that I'm going to lower this. Okay. My name is Jerry Hush. I'm a sociologist that just completed a project with UNICEF where I was the accountability project manager, which was after having been the accountability project specialist at UNDP. I have a background having worked at WHO and having been on a cross-organizational analysis of WHO, FAO, and Codex Alimentarius. So I'm very aware of the food standards issues that are being in part. And I want to thank very much all of you on the panel. This is an extraordinary group of people, and I deeply appreciate being able to raise this question with you. My concern is that I've heard a discussion which in essence does not really provide an alternative solution. What I've heard here is in some ways, although there is a very powerful critique, and I think Dr. Sachs provided that as well as the other people who at the panel, but I'm concerned that the complexity of the issue necessitates really thinking out of the box. And I say that in the sense that the issues here are an integrated concern about what's being labeled as food sovereignty, which has to do with land and power issues, food security, which is defined in terms of nutritional issues, and one which unfortunately has been lost, but I think is necessary to bring to the table, food safety issues. Because the development of food standards, which are used for the WTO, have tremendous impact on livelihoods and capital investment. And so my question actually to the panel is, how can we take what I agree may appear to be a very bureaucratic solution, and having worked with people in the last week on the CFA and their concern about being involved with these negotiations, there's concern that if you present it to the national government, the actors there are not really going to come up with viable plans of action because the key power players are still going to be at a national level. So I'm really interested in how are you responding to these very powerful comments and need for a truly alternative solution than what the World Bank is presenting, and using data, quite frankly, that has available in the FAO but has actually been quite ignored in these solutions. So I'm asking to sort of push the box a little bit.
Are you asking this question to anyone in particular?
No, I think there's
John?
whoever wants to jump up.
I'm not sure what you really mean by a truly alternative solution. I mean, I think we were very conscious in looking at what can we actually do, that a lot of what we're suggesting has been suggested before. As our colleague here was pointing out, there are plenty of African agricultural plans gathering dust on the shelves, which are perfectly good, but never been implemented through lack of will and lack of resources. So why should it be different this time? So, I think we're conscious that we're trying not to reinvent the wheel too much, but there may be an element of that. But the point is, most of the solutions are known, and we just have to do it. I think that the area where I think we really do need to think more out of the box and find some alternative is, I think I touched on it in what I said, in actually finding new models of agriculture, which are not dependent on massive injections of capital and fertilizer. And fertilizer is itself a product which is not going to exist forever. It has all sorts of damaging effects as well as the benefit it produces in the short term. There is work going on. I'm not an expert, obviously, but there is work going on to try to produce new models of conservation agriculture which have very reduced tillage of the land, so you lose less of the nutrients in actually the process of agriculture. Whether they're sufficient and sufficiently well advanced to be really operable in the long term, I don't know. But in the short term, I think we have to rely on the things we know work, which are better seeds and better fertilizers, and then all the rural infrastructure investments we're talking about. There's a lot of controversy also, which we haven't touched on at all, about technology, biotechnology, genetically modified foods, etc., etc., and a lot of fear generated by that debate. But I think technology has got to be part of the answer if we're going to produce a lot more food from essentially the same amount of land. It can't all be done by extra capital inputs, partly for the reason I've given, that fertilizer is a problem as well as a solution. So I think we do need some more genuinely out-of-the-box thinking in that sort of area, and maybe in the technology area too. I'm not sure that's what you really mean by a truly alternative solution. But that's the kind of thing which I think we haven't done yet, because we've been focusing on what we know how to do. I think that needs to be the kind of thing you're talking about, if that's what it was, also needs to be done, to find models which will really work so that we don't, in trying to solve the global food crisis, make the global environmental crisis worse. And there's a real risk of that if we're not careful.
Dr. Vashee, do you want to add something?
Yeah, the point I was trying to make was that you can't underestimate the influence of the UN system or any other multilateral agencies. The influence they have on developing country governments is phenomenal. If they see at a global level that it's just business as usual, it's the government and it's the bureaucrats who are going to find a solution, that permeates down to the national level. What is happening right now is a lot of farmers' organizations are actually demanding of their governments to set up national task force to look at the food crisis. It's beholden to the government to take them on board or not, but more and more people are seeing this as an integrated approach between government, farmers, private sector, agribusiness, NGOs, if you like, the trade unions. It's the whole player in the economy who are going to find a solution. I think when you say out of the box, perhaps the way I see it, it's more a question of what we have been doing and what we have been doing correctly. Because a lot of examples are around which can be replicated, upscaled, which can work in a lot of countries. So perhaps we need to look more within, where are they working, why are they working, how did they work, and replicate those. Because really and truly, the only nearer thing I can see is the environmental angle to all this, which everybody agrees we should be doing, but nobody wants to pay for it, and they expect the farmers once again to grow cheap food and do environmental mitigation pro bono. And I think this is where the only change I can see.
We'll take another question. Perhaps we'll take two.
Good evening. My name is Elisha Schwa. I'm a SIPA student. I'm not a biologist nor an agronomist in this case, but I had a question about the grain reserves. I remember Professor Sachs mentioning that one of the problems in developing countries was that the grains they had were 1 year old, and that reduced the productivity. So maybe could you elaborate on how the grain reserves would work? Thank you very much.
Well, I'll try without, as I say, claiming to be an expert on grain reserves. I think it's clear that one of the problems that there was earlier this year was that there were virtually no grain reserves, or at least the grain reserves stocks were at the lowest level for 50 years, or whatever the figure was. And that meant there's nothing you could release onto the market to bring the prices down, the global prices. I mean, we shouldn't be totally mesmerized by global prices, because the amount of global rice that is traded globally is relatively small, actually. Nevertheless, it has an effect on local prices as well. Now, there are big problems about grain reserves, because you have to manage them very carefully. It's got to be stored very carefully. It can get eaten by rats and pests and other things. So, it can easily be very wasteful if you're not careful. So that's why people moved. I mean, people moved away from grain reserves, both because they were not, they were very hard to manage in an economically efficient way, and because they didn't seem to be necessary. Because when food was cheap and plentiful, and you just went and bought whatever you needed on the world market, why bother with a reserve? And I think people are now realizing that you do need reserves, but there's still the problem of how you manage them, which needs to be tackled. I think what we're beginning to look at now is what is called, it's a bit of a misnomer, is virtual reserves, where each country doesn't need to hold a huge stock, but countries can have some stock which can then be pooled in time of need. So you have a regional reserve for the South Asian countries, or the Southeast Asian countries, or some African countries, where each of them has some kind of stock which can be called on by the other, so you don't have to have too many national stocks rotting away in the bins. I think that is a possible way forward. As I say, I think the SARC, the South Asian regional organisation, is looking at that. I think ASEAN, the Southeast Asian regional organisation, is also looking at that. I think that may be a way forward, but then you still need the problem of how you manage it, how you don't keep the grain too long, and how you actually rationalise it. And I think one solution that people have looked at is that governments should not be allowed to manage grain reserves because they're no good at it. So you should, in some way, hand it over to some private sector with appropriate incentives to actually manage it in a sensible way. So the issue is being looked at again. I think we will go back to a system where there are some reserves there, but hopefully a more rational system than the one that existed before.
Would you like to add something?
No, just to say, I quite agree, because in the past, any public stocks that were held by governments, coming either from the farming side or the public sector, private sector, the interventions and the temptations they have are enormous to disrupt the market. So, in a way, it was logical we moved away from there. Obviously, inventory was a problem. What we are looking more is some sort of a strategic reserve which allows you a lead time to build up and move stocks, what we call a strategic reserve in national countries, and which can be pulled together. But again, we're still not looking at massive amounts of grain reserves, just a strategic one, just enough so that there's no famine, but it allows for any other food aid or anything to come in. Maybe if it's a landlocked country like mine, you're looking at maybe a 2.5 month lead time, and basically that's your consumption, that's your strategic reserve, which we will think it's important to keep. But again, like John has said, what happens when you don't have a problem? How do you offload your bins, and how do they go into the market? And we're looking at that, where we want to find a solution where it doesn't necessarily disrupt the agriculture markets. But I think we still haven't fixed it in earnest. I think people are just massaging it at the moment.
We have a long list of students who want to ask questions. I would ask the students to ask short questions and
Short answers. Yes.
possibly short answers too. Okay.
My name is Patrick Gallick, and I am a student. My question would be for you, Mr. Holmes. I first appreciate that you are all here to come and speak to us, and this is an excellent panel. My question would be, forgive my pessimism, but looking at the last 30 years of policy that has failed and has left many countries worse off now than they were before, my first question is, how are you going to move forward after 2015 when this plan is done? In the light of some of the very controversial ways that this plan goes about. The first one being reliance on fertilizer, which would be oil produced, and we know all the problems with the oil. Second, especially, would be with the population fund and the encouraging of these agricultural societies to have only 2 children. That works if there is water that is close by, there's some sort of electric, there's farming with more efficient tools. However, if you don't have those, it's necessary to have 5 or 6 children in order to take care of the food, get the water, collect firewood. In my experience of seeing it in these countries,
Short question.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the first question would be, how would you move on after 2015? And second, has there been any sort of research into what can the implications be that if this doesn't work well, what will this do to the countries? Thank you.
John, you want to start?
Well, I think the starting point is that there is a recognition that existing policies did fail and that they were mistaken. I think and there's a general recognition of that. You don't hear people saying that very often, but because they don't like to admit that they were wrong. But it is very clear that that's what they are doing on a general level. So hopefully we will avoid at least the mistakes of the last 30 years. Now, what happens if it doesn't work? And there are all sorts of reasons why it may not work, and they're mainly to do with not enough resources going into it, not enough political will behind it, as I was suggesting. I think the consequences for globally, and they're not just for developing countries, the consequences globally are going to be very serious in terms of food prices continuing to rise and lack of food availability. So it is this is an existential crisis which we have to solve. And we'll have to keep on rethinking what the right policy recommendations are as we go along. I don't think we would pretend that we've got the solution for forever and ever here now. All we have to do is do it. I think we have to keep on revisiting it. I think your description of the way developing country families work is a bit simplistic. I think, as others have been saying, I think if you have the education and a degree of prosperity, then the family planning will come into operation. And the phenomenon Jeffrey Sachs was talking about of smaller and smaller farms between larger and larger, not family units, but not necessarily small families themselves, is a real one. And I saw it. I was in Ethiopia 3 or 4 weeks ago in an area which is arid, is rain-fed agriculture, where drought is endemic, and yet the population is growing very fast. It's simply unsustainable. So it's not really that people are, and I don't think people are producing children just to till the land because they don't have enough land to till. I think you can tackle that in other ways. I think you can tackle it in ways through having some better tools which are less labour intensive. I'm not talking about tractors, that's impractical for most small farmers, but for at least better tillers and things which can be developed. So I don't think we're absolutely compelled to have people producing very large families just to do the manual labour forever and ever. So what I think we need to do is to keep on looking at the methods we're using, moving away from fertiliser, as I've already been suggesting, and finding ways in which you can produce a green revolution. In Africa particularly, it's not only Africa, we focus on Africa because that's where it's most needed perhaps, but it can be done. Only 4% of agriculture in Africa at the moment is irrigated, compared to, I think it's 50 or 60% in Asia. Reverse, just changing that alone would produce a lot more food, and that it needs an investment, but the technology is not particularly difficult. And the water is there if you can channel it in the right sort of way. So I think there are things we can do which will make a difference.
Thoraya?
Just quickly to tell you that the information or the data we have says there are 200 million women in the world who would like to have less children, but they have no access to family planning services. So the desire to have smaller families is certainly there, but the access to these services is not available. Now, the UN statistics tell us that to the year 2050, right now we're about 6 billion plus. By 2050, we can either be 9 billion or we can be 12 billion. And the scenarios are based as to whether men and women can have access to plan their families or not. If they can, then we will double. Niger will quadruple by the year 2050, just an example. So basically, we do have a target we have to fulfill by 2015 under the Millennium Development Goal number 5 of maternal health, which says universal access to reproductive health by 2015. What is happening now in the countries, and if you take Africa as an example, in Maputo, they have the African Union adopted what they call the strategy for sexual and reproductive health for Africa. And the whole idea is how do you integrate these issues into the maternal health roadmap so that women can go to a center and have a package of services that deal with all their needs throughout. I think it is doable in many of the countries, but in other countries, due to weak structures and so on, we will not reach that target by 2015. But certainly we're shooting as close as possible. There is a will on this issue. But for the past 8 years, we did have a major setback, which is the position of the United States against family planning. And the pressure applied to countries on being able to access resources. Just today, the Mary Stopes International put out a press release saying that the USAID staff have been asked to pressure some, and they named 4 or 5 of the African countries, not to release any resources to Mary Stopes International for family planning purposes. And Mary Stopes is saying that in some countries they provide up to 25% of the package of reproductive health services. So you need the cooperation also from the major donors who have impact on countries. So the issue is not the political will of the developing countries. It's also the political decisions of the powerful. So we hope that at one point the US would reverse and therefore push this agenda further, because it does have impact on many countries.
That's a very interesting answer.
Hi, my name is Marcy Hirsch. I'm a second-year student studying gender and development, and my question is for Ms. Obaid. So first, I'd like to thank you so much for your sensitivity to the experience of women and girls in the food crisis. And my curiosity lies in a specific aspect of women in crisis, and that is gender-based violence. And I was wondering if you could speak to the general way that that the food crisis, which has hit women so hard in particular, and how that perhaps has increased and aggravated women's susceptibility to gender-based violence, or the increase in gender-based violence in different cultures as a result of the increased tension.
Well, on the humanitarian part, I'm sure John is better to speak than me, but certainly the vulnerability of women gets higher with crisis and so on. But we even know, among the information we have, that for countries not in conflict, women are seeking to be commercial sex workers in order to feed the family. So already the first violence is taking place that way. In conflict situations, if they are hungry and have to feed the family, then that goes with it, selling themselves if necessary, but selling themselves in a way that has violence with it, has rape and so on. So the vulnerability, it's not the issue of the food, it's the poverty and the instability and the absence of protection that will make them much more vulnerable, whether it is food, fuel, whatever it is. The vulnerability of women, especially in a humanitarian setting, is very important. But working with John through the humanitarian network interagency, which includes NGOs and so on, we're working through clusters, and we try to mainstream in each cluster issues of gender. For example, under protection, women should be involved in planning the camp so that there are lights, they're not far away, the latrines, very practical things to provide an environment where women in a camp can be protected. And the rape doesn't take place by enemies. Sometimes it's within the camp of the same group of people who are there. So the issue is very much on the agenda. The problem is, though, we are all dealing with the after fact of the violence. DRC is a democratic, it's a big example right now in which a number of us, UNICEF, us, and various governments are trying to work on it. All of us are dealing with what happens when a woman is raped and how can we help her. And we are not able yet to cope with stopping the rape. And I think this is something, yes, the ICC declared it's a crime against humanity, etc. But again, we have not been able really to work to get that stopped. Maybe John can help here.
Not really much to add to what you said, Thoraya. I mean, I think I don't think we've seen a very direct link between food security and gender-based violence so far, at least, other than the one that Thoraya was talking about, of women being forced into prostitution just to feed their families. But the issue of gender-based violence is quite bad enough before any food security issues arise, and not least in the DRC. And the frustration is precisely the one that Thoraya identifies. We can do better at treating people afterwards. We're not doing very well at actually stopping it happening. I mean, that's because it's not very easy to stop it happening. Actually, the only way to stop it happening or to reduce the incidence of gender-based violence in places like Congo is to remove the underlying political and security problems in the existence of illegal armed presences in that country. Without doing that, we won't really tackle the problem, even if we do a bit better at improving the general culture.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ehsan, and I'm a first-year student here. My question is for Mr. Holmes, and in the current global financial crisis, financing is a big concern for this project and any of such big global projects. What are your insights on the inherent the politics of global aid, especially considering international institutes like World Bank and IMF have been historically sort of at least blamed for being used as political instruments by the big powers. So how do you, what new steps concrete steps do you feel that can be taken to address these issues? Because the project this action puts a lot of emphasis on participation by all different organizations. Yeah, that's it.
Short answer.
Well, it is a big question, even if it was a short question. I mean, I think that there's several ways of answering. I think we don't know yet what the effects of the global financial crisis will be on aid flows. Obviously, it's not likely to be very good. That goes without saying. But exactly how bad it's going to be, how bad the economic crisis will impact on developed country budgets and therefore on their aid budgets as well. I simply don't know yet. What we can see, though, is that a lot of countries are making genuine efforts, certainly in Europe, to increase their aid budgets and to reach somewhere near the 0.7% target of their budgets to go for aid. But the demands are increasing all the time. And in my particular area, the humanitarian affairs area, you can see demands are going up because of climate change, because of the global food crisis, because of conflicts in various places. And people are struggling to keep up. We need huge amounts of money to deal with the mitigation of climate change, but also the adaptation to climate change. We need huge amounts of money for the global food crisis. We're talking about $700 million we need between now and the end of the year just to keep people alive in Ethiopia and Somalia, for example. The figures are large. It's not clear where that money is going to come from. One of the things I think we have to do is to widen the donor base. If you look at most development and humanitarian aid, it comes from a very small group of countries, about 12 countries in Europe and the US and Canada. There are large numbers of countries who are increasingly prosperous in Latin America or in Asia, and particularly in the Gulf, for example, who do not contribute as I think they should. And so if we could widen that donor base, I think that would be one way of mitigating the effects that are likely to be there of the global financial and economic crises. I mean, it is seen as, the developed countries' burden to do this, and I think they are adopting that to some extent, although not enough, but that base has got to be widened, otherwise we simply won't have the resources.
Thank you. Oh, Thoraya.
Just quickly,
Yes?
I think the Africa, especially Africa, I was attending the TCAD 4, the Japan-Africa Relationship Conference, and the message that came from the African leaders is that, yes, aid okay, but we want trade. And the emphasis is on liberalizing trade, but also on processing products in the country, so to create job creation and things of that sort. So the message from the developing countries is don't take the raw material, produce it somewhere else and bring it back to us. Let us work with us to be able to produce it here so that we can. So the politics of aid is also being changed by developing countries now speaking up and saying, no, that's not the way we want to go. We want to go this way. And I think it's important to do that. But also in the pledges that were announced, the 11 billion or whatever, I think it reminded me of something my previous boss, Kofi Annan, said. He said, pledges are good, but cash is much better.
I think just one extra point is that not all these problems can be solved by money. A lot of them are solved by governments having good policies and good governance and lack of corruption.
Exactly.
That's actually more important than aid flows usually.
This is a huge program. However, if you are talking about good governance and fight against corruption, and very often the food crisis has an immediacy, which obviously, this kind of strategy takes a long, long time. What I find fascinating to listen to is that you deploy a peacekeeping operation in Haiti to stabilize the country. And suddenly you have a food crisis which engenders, political problems where you have the government which obviously is losing its prime minister and 4 months without a government. And it happened not exactly the same, but there were problems in 33 countries, if I remember, linked, and I'm talking now about political problems, because of the anger and so on, and linked to this financial crisis. So on one hand, you try to stabilize a country with a peacekeeping operation, and on the other hand, the stabilization collapses because there is a food crisis, not to talk about the hurricanes, obviously, in Haiti. But you can see how daunting this is, and also the donors who are looking at this and do not know exactly how to deal with this. And I don't think we have realized the implication of all this yet, in the context of the new crisis coming to us, which is the financial crisis. There were lots of pledges at the UN last week, but as you said, where is the cash? And how are we going to cut the pie, which is shrinking more and more? So next question.
My name is Sasha Chavkin. I'm a first-year student, and this question is for Mr. Vashee. And my question is what the role of agriculture subsidies for basic food crops in the United States and Europe is on the food crisis, particularly for farmers in the developing world.
historically, any subsidies in the developed countries has the effect of overproduction, which invariably ends up on the markets of developing countries, which displaces local production, prevents farmers from taking full opportunity, has prevented developing country governments from taking necessary policy reforms, prioritizing agriculture. So in view of the food crisis, I think we still don't need those subsidies in the developed countries. Essentially what we will require is more productivity from the smallholder farmers in developing countries. And if we are going to have a targeted, specific intervention which allows for some sort of subsidy to a catalytical intervention, if you like, to get that productive base up, because you have to realize that with globalization and liberalization, a lot of the resource base of smallholder farmers has been completely eroded. You need to recapitalize them to stay on the land, get back into productive production. And the only way you're going to do is to have some sort of transfer of wealth back to them. I mean, there was a World Bank study that was done which was called the plundering of agriculture, which meant that they were giving subsidies or cheap money to farmers and then not allowing the markets to function. And as a consequence, systematically, you are transferring rural incomes to the urban areas and making the poor poorer. So in relation to your question, I think we still need to move away from subsidies in developed countries. It is actually allowing people to produce what they shouldn't be producing. It's not allowing the optimization of their competitive or comparative advantages. And it still has the ability to displace and stop important reforms. Because again, food aid is going to come in. How is it going to be offloaded on the market? How are you going to do the price discovery? Is it going to go through a commodity exchange, for example? It's normally a back-to-back commodity transaction between a government and another government. So I hope I've tried my best to answer your question.
Yes.
My name is Michael Klein, studying Management of Humanitarian Affairs here at SIPA. And my question is about assessment. Some was said earlier about the unreliability of figures surrounding the crisis. And a lot of the assessment models couldn't really predict the severity because it kind of broke the mold of historic price fluctuations. So especially going forward and targeting the right kinds of farmers and the right kinds of markets for the medium to long-term investment strategies, I was wondering what are there new investment assessment and or monitoring procedures, and how and where will we be getting our information?
Shall I make a start on that? I mean, we do recognize the need to have better assessments of needs in particular countries, and also better monitoring models. I mean, if you look at the Comprehensive Framework for Action document, you'll see quite a lot of references to the need to have really good monitoring of prices, agricultural prices, of nutritional status of people, so that you actually get early warning of what's going on. You don't have to react too late after the event. And I think most of that actually needs to be done at country level. I mean, you can have global monitoring, but if you want to really know what's going on, you have to take each country and make sure you have good assessment models there and good monitoring systems. And that's one of the things we're trying to do as part of this task force's work, is to set up in the countries which are most affected, and we've identified 27 countries which are the most affected, but there are others as well, and to really set up these coordination, monitoring and assessment structures so we can actually follow it in real time much more closely, and then intervene as necessary to make sure that whatever we're doing fits the reality, not what we sort of hope might be the reality. I mean, assessment in these situations is very difficult. I mean, I know from my wider work on the humanitarian side that our needs assessment models are not good enough, but it's hard. I mean, if it was easy, we'd have fixed it. It's hard to do needs assessment, and it's hard to do evaluation of what impact you've had afterwards, even though you might think it was easy. But we are working to try and get better models, across different areas. So we're not just measuring food, we're also measuring health, nutrition, sanitation, because you need to have a picture of the whole thing before you know exactly how to intervene.
I think if you need research on this, I'm sure there'll be volunteers among the students. It's a good research project.
Absolutely. We need help.
I think there's been some work done before this food crisis and all this task force, and it originated more from the WTO, especially for the aid for trade, where a lot of LDC countries embarked on commodity-based value chain analysis, basically to prioritize the gaps. I don't know whether it fits into the bill, but a lot of work has been done to analyze where are the gaps. And I quite agree with John. I think the monitoring and evaluation of any intervention is important, and that has been a failure of the past, where nobody's bothered to evaluate aid and the effectiveness of aid. And I think that's an important thing that has to be factored in. And perhaps even from the planning stage, it's important to get more and more people involved in the planning so that you get different players giving you different input for the expected results.
Yes, Thoraya.
A quick word. I think going even further back, the issue of population census and household surveys. That's the basis where you know what's your population structure, you know, what's the age structure, where are they dispersed, and so on. And we have a census coming up for 2010 for all countries. There are 100 countries that are asking for help, but that's 2010. But the fact that 10 years ago the same thing has happened, the weakness in these governments, one, is that they don't often follow with the analysis of the data that they have collected. Two, we are having a disappearance of demographers. It's not anymore an area of study that's attractive to young people. They're going different areas. And so we're trying to bring up the area of demography again, because you need to know, you have that skill to be able to know, the board that you're going to work in, what is it, the composition of these people that, and this will allow you, not in a crisis, but at least for planning purposes, to look at what are your projections for food, for health, for schools, etc., etc. And we're hoping that this time we and the governments can do a better job of building the capacity of statisticians and demographers, having them sit and not be transferred here and there. Part of it is a governance issue as well.
I think just to add one point to that, I think, which is very important from Thoraya's point of view, we need to have a lot better disaggregated data.
Yes.
By which I mean,
yes,
it's fine knowing 100,000 people are affected, but you need to know who they are, how many are women, how many are children, how many are old, how many are handicapped. Then you've got a much better chance of actually targeting your interventions in a sensible way.
You ask a very difficult question.
Hi, my name's Alan Strauss. I do food policy analysis at a local labor union, United Food and Commercial Workers, Local 1500. My question is for Mr. Holmes. A number of thinkers, namely Francis Moore Lepay, have shown that there's more than enough food in the world to feed everyone. So I'm curious about why the UN would take the perspective that this is a production issue and not a distribution issue. Thank you.
Well, I mean, of course, you're right. There is, if it was perfectly distributed, there would be enough food to go round, but it isn't. Very far from that, as we were all commenting early on. So I think there probably is more work to be done on distribution, but that's the basis of your question is why we're focusing on production in developing countries and not production overall. Production overall can be increased. It is being increased. You increase the price of wheat and rice, people plant more wheat and rice, the harvests go up, which is fine because that brings the prices down for everybody, but it doesn't actually necessarily produce better food security in developing countries. So that's why the focus of our efforts is on small farmers in developing countries to get food being produced close to people's where they live, in a reliable way, so they are, I say, self-sufficiency is a goal we're trying to avoid overall, but they are more self-sufficient than they are now, less liable to the whims of and vagaries of the international markets, and that's going to be a better situation for everybody, and also, as I say, help the poverty angle. I mean, the question of distribution of food is a much more, it's a much deeper question about how markets operate. I think agricultural trade, getting that much fairer and better and reducing all the subsidies that we were talking about, that's part of it too. But I think some of these problems can be tackled if we can actually put more production of food where most of the people are.
Next question.
Hello, my name is Irene Galtung. I'm a PhD student, and I wanted to say that so having minimum food and water are rights, so it's not about finding a charitable solution to these problems. And so I was wondering what you think about the idea, or whether it would be helpful if these rights could be seriously claimed in courts. And there have been actually 5 to 10 court cases on the right to food and water which have been claimed successfully in the world. So maybe there will be millions of court cases one day that might appear. Then that's my question to you.
Well, that's a very difficult question indeed. I was just looking for there is a definition somewhere here of the right to food. Well, I won't go through it because it's quite complicated. I mean, I think one of the difficulties is that the kind of economic and social rights you're talking about, and there is a lot of discussion about the rights-based approach to these issues, and not just production and so on. One of the fundamental differences between political rights, human rights as classically defined, and social and economic rights is that the political and human rights are justiciable, that is, they can be taken to court, and the economic rights are very hard to take to court. Now, maybe someone will do it successfully, and maybe that will push us more in a rights-based direction, but it's quite hard to translate the right to food and all the, as I say, if you read it, all the conditions that go with it into something which is justiciable and that will actually make a difference in practice, at least in the short term. But which is not to say I don't agree with the idea of trying to use the courts in some way, at least in some countries.
I don't know about the courts, but in a way the discussion leads us to look at the issue of security in a completely different way. It's obvious that we are talking about human security now, much more than we are talking about military security. And if you have people who cannot eat, or people who cannot be educated, or people who cannot breathe the air, or whatever, people are not safe. So I think this is a concept, a paradigm which has changed a lot at the UN too, this issue of human security rather than military security. And food is part of it. If you can't eat, you are not secure. If you can't breathe, you are not secure. I'm just saying that because this is something where, we are constantly talking about, security in terms of soldiers. But here is a commodity food which is really linked directly to the security of people. And of course, the anger that we talked about, if they don't have the food, is anyway going to jeopardize, also the physical security, and you are not safe anymore, and you can't. So here we go. Here's the vicious circle and how complex these issues can be. Thank you.
The UN has a rapporteur on the right to food who is producing a lot of work in the sort of area you're talking about.
My name is Leila. I'm a student here at SIPA. First of all, thank you very much to the panelists. Professor Lindenmayer has touched a bit upon how the food crisis is affecting countries in conflict. I was wondering if the panel could talk about the specific repercussions of the crisis in countries in conflict, in particular maybe the Haitian case, and how UN bodies are being affected, such as DPKO or OCHA. Thank you.
I'm not sure Haiti is necessarily the best example, actually. I think if you look at three areas where you have the worst combination of drought and food price rises and conflict, is Afghanistan, where there's a very serious drought in parts of the country, and food price, the price of wheat flour has, if it's available at all, has gone up enormously. And of course, you have the effects of conflict, and you have massive problems there, which we're appealing for resources for, because we need to feed people to keep them alive. And of course, we need to tackle the underlying issues about redeveloping agriculture. And again, the population of Afghanistan, whatever else is happening, is also rising fast too. So it falls into the same problem of a rising population as well. Somalia. Again, you have the same, which is probably the worst situation in the world in some respects in parts of South and Central Somalia, where, again, you have the same problem of drought and food price rises, which have gone up 200 or 300% in those areas of Somalia, and conflict. preventing people from just conducting their normal livelihoods, farming or whatever it might be, or the Somali region of Ethiopia. Again, you get the same combination. In all these areas, the needs are huge. The last thing any of these areas need is the food price crisis, as well as the other factors they're facing. So it is just another major aggravating factor which can push communities over the edge. The reality is, of course, and when we started a bit from here, is that there are many countries in Africa, West Africa, for example, where the population lives on the edge of food insecurity the whole time. It's chronic food insecurity. We only really worry about it, and this is a fault of our system, when they are pushed over the edge by either a conflict or a drought or a flood. And then their normal methods of coping simply fail, and then we have to we suddenly rush in with a humanitarian emergency without having really tackled all the underlying problems that are there, which we call development problems, but they're actually humanitarian problems as well. Humanitarian response tends to be triggered by an event rather than by a state of people, and there's something actually wrong with that. Sorry, but that's a rather long answer to your question. I mean, Haiti, the issue is one of chronic underdevelopment, poverty, lack of forest cover, which makes everything that happens there exaggeratedly negative in its effects on the population. And as Elisabeth was saying, the peacekeeping force is trying to stabilize the country and has stabilized it to some extent politically, and then all that progress is destroyed and the country set back 2 or 3 years by the combined effects of the food crisis and then 4 hurricanes in succession, which shouldn't happen to any country, let alone Haiti.
Elizabeth, just one sentence. I think this shows what John is saying, and your question shows that we are sometimes artificially dividing humanitarian and development when they flow into each other, and it's a flexible, themes that go back and forth. So, and often we have problems. We might get lots of money for the immediate humanitarian stage, but we don't get money in the middle when countries are being moved into a more normalcy, peace context. So it's a very artificial categorization that our donors have put in place.
And if I may add, there is also a very artificial compartmentalization between peacekeeping, the money for peacekeeping, which is a cess contribution at the United Nations, and then peace building, so to speak, all the development, which is not always, but mostly on voluntary contribution, which make a huge difference. And we were discussing Rwanda with my class today, and that was a major problem for that peacekeeping operation, where the special representative was asking for money to help the country, and the Security Council answered, this is not peacekeeping, go to the General Assembly. This has evolved, and I think the Council has made the relation much more between development and peace, but there are still a lot of walls between those various things which have to be reconciled. So, next question.
Hi, I'm May Bend, and I am a second-year student at SIPA. I'm wondering, it's my understanding that increased globalization and urbanization have led some countries that were once net exporters of food to become net importers. And I'm wondering if reversing that trend might be part of the solution, and if so, what incentives could be provided not just to countries that we want to reverse this trend in, but to other countries that are influencing this trend. Thank you.
Well, I think the truth is that there are countries who are net exporters of food who become net importers of food, and it goes back to what we were discussing earlier about the neglect of agriculture and investment in agriculture in some of those countries. And it happened because, I mean, not only because the World Bank had a particular set of policies, but also because, as I was trying to suggest earlier, food was cheap and plentiful. Therefore, any country, the population, I mean, the country, the private sector, whoever was buying the food could find it, and could find it at very cheap prices. So the incentive to invest in producing your own food was not necessarily there, particularly, and this goes back to the point we were making earlier, if the market for what you might produce was biased against you, was distorted against you by subsidies being given elsewhere in developed countries. So that's why you need to tackle the whole set of policies that goes with this. You need to invest in agriculture, incentivize agriculture, get the right kind of national policies which will encourage agricultural investment and agricultural production, put in the research, put in the techniques, get the trade policies right, get the taxation policies right, and then you might have the, a virtuous circle which is encouraging food production, and then countries can become net exporters of food again. and can make a contribution to their own balance of payments rather than simply food being a drain on the balance of payments, which has become in recent years. I mean, one of the things that's actually happening at the moment is a large number of countries where the combined effects of the food crisis or food prices and fuel price rises means they have huge balance of payments problems. So that's another reason why they have to shift back into local food production as much as they can. So, I mean, our hope is that the combined effects of all the things we're talking about, if the resources and the will can be found and the impetus can be maintained, will reverse this process. I don't think you can say it's just because of globalization. Globalization can have a good effect if the set of policies which goes with it are right. But here we've been dealing with a set of perverse incentives which produced a very damaging result.
You're quite right about urbanization and rural poverty and cheap food availability in urban areas. Globalization invariably has meant economies of scale, large-scale production. That's the way to participate in the market. And I think some of the changes you're looking for will probably happen by default because it's going to get a lot more expensive to transport food between countries and within the country. So from our side, when I say the farming community, we're looking perhaps at more localized production. The small farmer and small-scale production is going to become more important because it's going to be more localized, more in the rural areas. And part of that, though not a lot of it, is going to happen by default due to globalization and how you adjust with globalization and structural change.
Can I add one thing? Go to our website, www.unfpa.org. Last year's our State of the World Population was on urbanization. And we did it with habitat. And basically we're saying that with the pattern of globalization that we have right now, urbanization is growing, urban areas, urban growth is becoming so high and so quick. And it's basically because the young generation see prosperity in the urban areas rather than in the rural areas. This does not mean, and we're saying that we should invest in managing how urbanization is taking place so we don't get ghettos and that kind of low income, absence of services and so on. And the idea is it's not that we should not look at rural areas and invest in agriculture. It's a must. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about the pattern of urbanization that take place, and we need to work to manage it and to ensure that the services for those who are coming are there. Look at the report. I think you'll find a different view.
Kevin, I thought you would have the last word, but you won't.
That's better. I was nervous about going last. So my name is Kevin Beal. I study international conflict resolution. So following up, I guess my question is for everyone, but more directed at Executive Director Obaid. I 100% agree with you that I think a lot of what we can do now to move things along at the UN is from the direction of empowering females, both as peace builders, generally natural peace builders in the community, and then likewise as financial planners and managers. So given that, I'm wondering, as you look at the bureaucracy of the UN as it stands at this moment, what would you implement on this very day as far as how would you change overcoming some of the historically patriarchal values of developing countries?
I'll get rid of all the generation of men right now.
From Saudi Arabia.
Beginning with my country. Yeah. No. I think the issue is not, the way I approach this issue is we have to listen to the people who matter. And the people who matter are the ones whose hands are in the fire. So it's one of them is listening to women, but the other group that we really should listen to are the young people. There is no way we as the United Nations can emerge and become something different to meet a new global world and the crisis in the global world if we don't listen to young people, but bring them in as experts, as resource persons, and so on, rather than, other categories, or ignore them and act on their behalf. So within that context, yes, we at UNFPA we're putting really lots of effort to do that, and we bring young people between the age of 18, 17, and 24 as resource persons to look at our programs and tell us, are we doing the right thing for young people or not? And they come in on a an arrangement of a 9-month arrangement, 6 months with us at headquarters, 3 months in our country offices to again look at our programs. And then we have advisory panels for our programs at the country level, regional level, and the global level. Plus these groups that come. And they come and they stay at the International House right here because it's cheaper for everybody. But the whole idea is we have to, yes, governments are critical, they are our bosses, we have to work with them. But part of our role with our bosses is to convince them that they need to listen to the people who matter.
You have the last word.
Good evening. My name is Tom. I'm a SIPA student. I have a question for Mr. Vashee. I want to come back to the rising food prices. And I have a very short question. To what extent are the small farmers benefiting from this rise, this increasing trend of agriculture prices? And if the small farmers are not benefiting, who is benefiting from these rising prices?
I'm sorry to inform you that the farmers aren't benefiting. That's the bottom line. Farm gate prices haven't increased. And the reason being, farmers are not well integrated into the value chain. There's a lot of misinformation on markets. The people that are part of the market have a lot of misinformation where they do project certain stocks or certain prices. It can have the effect in a vacuum of depressing prices. So it's the middlemen who are benefiting from this crisis. The speculators also on a global stage arena are benefiting. And that probably needs to be addressed because that's not giving the market signal the farmers want to step up production, because nothing's changed from them apart from the input costs now going up, and he's a lot worse off than he was before this crisis.